Hello! In this lesson we're going to talk about section 3.5 of the textbook, converting between fraction and decimal format for numbers. At this point we have three different formats for dealing with numbers that are parts of a whole or less than one whole. We've got fractions, decimals, and percentages. All three of these methods can be used to refer to the same number, and it's important to know how to convert back and forth. Let's take a look at how to convert from fraction to decimal format and back. First of all, there are certain fractions that you probably already know what the percent and decimal format of those fractions are. For instance, in this table here I have 1/2. Most of you know that 1/2 is 50%. If pressed, you'd be able to tell me that without having to do any special arithmetic for it. So 1/2 is 50%. Those are equivalent. Those two things mean the same thing. 1/2, 50%, same. If pressed, you would probably be able to tell me that the decimal equivalent of that is also pretty straightforward. That's going to be 0.5. Or as someone asked, if that 0 is necessary to the left, that's not. You could also just say that that's 0.5. Most of you also know a quarter, right? A quarter is 25 cents, so it's 25%. And then when dealing with money, you know that that is 0.25. So some conversions are ones that you should probably be able to do in your head without doing any arithmetic at all. 1/2, 1/4, 3/4, those are fractions that you probably ought to know the decimal and percentage equivalent of. Sometimes, though, it's not quite as straightforward. Take a look at these fractions down here. The directions say convert the fraction to a decimal and round to the hundredths place if necessary. Well, I'll start out with 5/8. Well, that's not really a unit of currency that we use, eighths of a dollar, so that's a bit tricky. You can't just do that in your head, most likely. So what's your process for dealing with this? Whenever you're converting a fraction to a decimal, it's as straightforward as this. It's the top divided by the bottom. In mathematics, just like in English, we typically go top to bottom and left to right when performing operations. So you can take out your calculator and just do the top number, the numerator in other words, divided by, and then do your bottom number. So 5 divided by 8. And hit equals. This is not the same as long division. I'm not doing 5 divided into 8. It's 5 divided by 8. And if you punch that into your calculator, it should tell you 0.625. If you do the division in the wrong direction, if you did 8 divided by 5, it would tell you something bigger than 1. So you'd know that that was not correct because this is a proper fraction. So 0.625 would be my decimal equivalent, and that's the exact decimal equivalent. But I have to read the fine print and be careful because the Hawks homework assignment will be very nitpicky about this. It does say round to the hundredths place. So I'm not actually done with this question yet. I've got to round this answer to the hundredths place. If you're unfamiliar with rounding with decimals, please go back and check out the video on that, or read through the textbook. My hundredths place is the second digit after the decimal point. I start at my decimal point, and I count 1, 2 spaces to the right, and there's my hundredths place. It's a 2. I've got to decide, do I need to round that 2 up or keep it the same? Well, I look after it, and it's followed by a 5. So that means I round it up to a 3. The 2 becomes a 3, and everything to the left stays the same. So 0.63 would be my final answer here. And I drop everything after when rounding with decimals. Don't put any zeros or anything after the decimal place that you rounded to. So 0.63 will be my final answer for this one. Alright, hit the pause button on this and try the fraction below, 3/7. See if you can convert that to a decimal, and then we'll go ahead and resume play and see if I get the same answer. Did you try it out? Let's see what we get. Same as before, top number divided by bottom number, so 3 divided by 7. And unfortunately, this one comes out rather ugly looking, but don't be afraid. Just because it's an ugly answer doesn't mean it's wrong. I get 0.428571 and so on, and this decimal just keeps right on going. It doesn't end anywhere. If your decimal stopped after 2 decimal places, your calculator might be formatted improperly. It might be always rounding to the hundredths place, which is great for questions that ask you to do so, but we'll have questions later on that don't, and in fact you need more than 2 decimal places, place values after the decimal. So please make sure that that calculator is formatted correctly. If in doubt, the calculator that's provided with Windows is a very good one. That one should be able to do pretty much every calculation you'll need to do. The calculator on most smartphones also. But as I said, this decimal just keeps right on going forever and ever. It doesn't stop at the 1. It'll just keep going, and in fact, your calculator won't be able to hold all the digits, so it'll just round it at some point. But we want to round to the hundredths place. So again, we'll start at that decimal point, and we'll count up 2 places to the right. And here's my 2. It's 2 places to the right. It's followed by an 8, so the 2 rounds up to a 3. And my final answer would be 0.43 here. Alright, so that's the process for converting a fraction to a decimal. What about going the other way? Let's take a look. We want to convert the decimal to a fraction in lowest terms or simplest form. Those two mean the same thing, by the way. Lowest terms or simplest form are just ways of saying the same thing. Let's take a look at this fellow on top, 0.015, and I'm saying it the informal way on purpose, because our process for converting this to a fraction is to actually read this out the formal way and identify the place value of the last digit. So if you were to actually tell me what this decimal were formally, you'd have to count out the place value here of your last digit. Well, I start with tenths, then hundredths, and then thousandths. So this number is 15 thousandths if you were to read it out properly, and that's exactly what the fraction version is going to be. That last place value is 1,000, so I'm going to take my number and I'm going to put it over 1,000. And when I say my number, I mean whatever is after that decimal. Well, here, 15. That 0 doesn't really do anything. It's a placeholder, and I don't need it when I'm just writing out the 15. So 15 over 1,000. As a double check, make sure that the number of zeros in your denominator is equal to the number of digits that were after the decimal place originally. So I've got 1, 2, 3 zeros down here, and I've got 1, 2, 3 digits after the denominator, or excuse me, after the decimal point in my original. Now again, it's important to read the fine print. It does say in lowest terms or simplest form here, so I'm going to have to reduce this. Taking a look at the top and bottom, the numerator and denominator here, anything that ends in a 0 or 5 can be divided by 5. So let's go ahead and do that division by 5. I'm going to reduce this, divide by 5 on the top and bottom. Alright, so 15 divided by 5, that ought to give me 3. And then 1,000 divided by 5, well, that's going to give me 200. One thing you'll notice with these specific questions that ask you to convert a decimal, or in some cases a percent, to a fraction, you're only going to have to check for factors of 5 and 2 for the most part. You're never going to have a factor of 7 or anything like that, because your denominator is always going to be 100 or 1,000 or some power of 10. So really the only things you need to look for are powers of 2 and 5 and products of those things. So if you just look for 2's and 5's, you'll eventually get it to lowest terms. That's a nice little trick to watch out for if reducing to lowest terms is something you have a hard time with. Alright, just like before, see if you can do this bottom one here, 0.064. See if you can convert that to a fraction in lowest terms. And go ahead and hit the pause button, see if you can get there on your own, and we'll resume in a couple seconds. Alright, so if you tried this one out, let's see if you got the same thing that I did. On purpose, I was using the same place value here just so that it wasn't too difficult to find the place value here, but counting things out, I've got 1, 2, 3, so that means I'm tenths, hundredths, thousandths. My denominator is going to be 1,000 again. But that's going to vary depending on how many digits are after the decimal place. Remember, the number of zeros in your denominator should match the number of digits after the decimal place. And I'll pop that 64 up here. And again, this is just really an exercise in reducing fractions to lowest terms. So 64 over 100, you can divide those both by 2, probably divide those both by 4. You can actually divide those both by 8, but let's go ahead and try 4 out, see if that works. So divide by 4 on top and bottom. And on top, 64 divided by 4 is going to be 16. And on the bottom, 1,000 divided by 4 is going to be 250. And I notice that the top and bottom are still even here, so I can divide them both by 2 again. Now, like I said, if you had known that both of those numbers were divisible by 8, you could go ahead and do that. But you can always just go by factors of 2, or 5 if 5s are possible. And I'm going to end up with 8 on top. 16 divided by 2 is 8, and then 250 divided by 2 is 125. Now, 125 is a big number, so it might feel like, oh, is this really in lowest terms? But the only things you can divide 125 by are 5 and 25 and 125, and none of those is going to go into 8. So there are no common factors on the top and the bottom. All right, so to review, converting between fractions and decimal format. To convert a fraction to a decimal, you simply divide the top by the bottom, and then, of course, you want to make sure that you round to the place value indicated. To convert a fraction to a decimal, read out the place value of the last digit, and that's going to be your denominator. The number of zeros in the denominator should match the number of digits after the decimal point, and then make sure you reduce to lowest terms. Watch out for factors of 2 and 5.